The ornate knocker on Thomas Wheeler's front door had barely stopped moving when the elderly man answered, his thin frame draped in an expensive but ill-fitting sweater. Rose Patterson stood on his doorstep, her weathered hands clutching a wicker basket filled with homemade bread, Christmas cookies, and small, thoughtfully wrapped gifts. The December wind whipped around them, carrying snowflakes that melted instantly on the heated pathway leading to his mansion. "I don't understand," Thomas said, his voice cracking slightly as he accepted the basket. His eyes, red-rimmed and sunken into a face marked by grief, darted from Rose to the offerings. "We've hardly spoken before today." Rose smiled gently, tucking a strand of silver hair behind her ear. "Sometimes, Mr. Wheeler, the people who need kindness most are the ones who never ask for it." She had noticed him earlier that day at the community center's Christmas Eve luncheon, sitting alone in the corner, barely touching his food. When she overheard someone mention that Thomas Wheeler had lost his wife of 52 years just 3 months ago, something inside her chest tightened. She knew that particular pain all too well. "Please," she added, "it's nothing fancy. Just some homemade things to brighten your Christmas morning." Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he invited her in for tea. The interior of his home was a stark contradiction, clearly expensive furnishings, but with a hollow emptiness that no amount of wealth could disguise. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece, but a fine layer of dust had settled over them. A massive Christmas tree stood in the corner, perfectly decorated yet somehow lifeless, with no presents beneath it. They had just settled in his living room, Rose declining tea but accepting a seat, when the doorbell rang again. Thomas frowned, clearly not expecting anyone else. "Your family, perhaps?" Rose suggested hopefully. The shadow that crossed his face told her otherwise before he could speak. "My children don't visit anymore," he said simply, rising to answer the door. What happened next would change both their lives forever. 3 men in impeccable suits stood at the entrance, their expressions stern and unyielding. One held a leather briefcase, another a tablet computer. The youngest of them stepped forward. "Mr. Wheeler, we apologize for the intrusion on Christmas Eve. We're from Hargrove, Bennett, and Associates. We represent your children." His eyes shifted to Rose, who had appeared behind Thomas. "We need to speak with you. Privately." Thomas's face drained of what little color it had. "Whatever you have to say can be said in front of my guest." The lawyer's jaw tightened. "Sir, we've been informed that an unknown elderly woman was seen entering your home bearing gifts. Given recent events and concerns about your vulnerability, your children have instructed us to investigate immediately." Rose felt her cheeks burn with humiliation as she realized what was happening. These men, these lawyers, thought she was some kind of predator, targeting a wealthy widower in his time of grief. Thomas's hand clutched the doorframe. "You think she's after my money?" His voice rose sharply, indignation momentarily overpowering his grief. "Sir, we're simply doing our due diligence. There have been several cases in this neighborhood of elderly residents being targeted by what? Kindness? On Christmas Eve?" Thomas's voice shook, but not from weakness. The frail man who had answered the door minutes ago was transforming before Rose's eyes, steel entering his spine. And that's when it happened. Thomas Wheeler swayed suddenly, one hand rising to his chest. The basket Rose had brought tumbled from his other arm, homemade cookies scattering across the marble floor like broken promises. "Mr. Wheeler." Rose moved forward instinctively, medical training from decades past taking over as the lawyers stood frozen in shock. "Someone call 911. The ambulance had come and gone, leaving Rose sitting in the waiting room of Memorial Hospital, still dressed in her Christmas Eve outfit, a simple red sweater with embroidered snowflakes that her granddaughter had given her last year. She twisted her wedding ring absently, a habit she'd developed in the 2 years since Harold's passing. "Mrs. Patterson?" A nurse approached, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Wheeler is asking for you." Rose nodded, rising slowly from the uncomfortable plastic chair. At 72, her knees protested sudden movements, but she'd learned to live with discomfort. 38 years as a registered nurse had taught her that much. "How is he?" she asked, following the younger woman down the corridor. Stable. It wasn't a heart attack, thankfully, more likely a stress response combined with low blood pressure. The doctor wants to keep him overnight for observation. The hospital corridors were adorned with half-hearted Christmas decorations, paper snowflakes, and tinsel strung along the nursing station. A worn artificial tree stood in the corner of the waiting area, its lights blinking in an irregular pattern. Rose had spent more Christmases than she cared to remember in hospitals just like this one, tending to patients while her own family celebrated without her. Thomas lay propped up against white pillows, and in his arm and color returning to his cheeks. His room was private, the perks of wealth still evident even in his vulnerable state. The youngest lawyer from earlier stood awkwardly by the window, his expensive suit looking rumpled now, his professional demeanor cracked by genuine concern. "Rose," Thomas said, his voice stronger than before. "I want to apologize for what happened." She waved away his words. "There's nothing to apologize for." "There is." His eyes, sharp blue despite his 82 years, fixed on hers. "My children." He trailed off, glancing at the lawyer. The young man cleared his throat. "Mr. Wheeler's family has been concerned about his welfare since Mrs. Wheeler's passing. Given his considerable assets, they've instructed us to be vigilant." "Vigilant," Thomas repeated, the word bitter on his tongue. "What Lawrence means is that my children think I've lost my mind along with my wife. They're waiting for me to give away their inheritance to the first charlatan who shows me kindness." Rose took a seat beside the bed. "I'm sure they're just worried about you." Thomas snorted. "They haven't visited in months. Not even after Elaine died." His voice caught on his late wife's name. 40 years building a company, providing them with every advantage, and now they can't be bothered to call their father on Christmas Eve. But they can send lawyers the moment they think their money is at risk. The pieces began falling into place for Rose. Thomas Wheeler wasn't just any elderly man, he was Thomas Wheeler of Wheeler Engineering, the firm responsible for half the major infrastructure projects in the state. She'd read about his retirement 5 years ago, handing the reins to his oldest son while retaining majority ownership. "I didn't know who you were when I brought that basket," Rose said quietly. "I just saw someone who looked as lonely as I've felt since Harold passed." Thomas studied her face, searching for deceit and finding none. "You're a widow too." She nodded. 2 years in January. He had Parkinson's for 12 years before that. I was his caregiver. The lawyer's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then excused himself to take the call in the hallway. "Why did you come to me today, Rose?" Thomas asked once they were alone. "Of all the lonely old men in town, why me?" Rose folded her hands in her lap, considering the question. "I saw myself in you, I suppose. That first Christmas without Harold nearly broke me. My children were wonderful, but they have their own families, their own traditions. There's a specific kind of emptiness when half of you is suddenly gone." Thomas's eyes glistened. "Elaine loved Christmas. Went overboard every year, even when it was just the two of us rattling around in that big house." He swallowed hard. "This year, I couldn't even bring myself to unpack the ornaments she collected. The decorators did everything." "That explains the perfect but soulless tree," Rose said with gentle understanding. "Exactly." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. $50,000 for holiday decorations, and not an ounce of joy in any of it. Outside the hospital room, raised voices drifted through the partially open door. The lawyer was arguing with someone. "That'll be my daughter," Thomas sighed. "Caroline has always been the most protective. And the most suspicious." As if on cue, the door swung open. A woman in her 50s, expensively dressed with Thomas's same sharp blue eyes, stood in the doorway. Her gaze landed on Rose like a physical blow. "So," she said coldly, "this is the woman who sent my father to the hospital on Christmas Eve. Caroline." Thomas's voice carried a warning edge that momentarily silenced his daughter. "This is Rose Patterson." She's the reason I'm receiving proper medical care instead of collapsing alone in my home. Caroline Wheeler stepped fully into the room, followed by the uncomfortable-looking lawyer and an older man who bore a striking resemblance to Thomas, his son, undoubtedly. Caroline's tailored wool coat and designer boots suggested she'd traveled from somewhere with colder weather, her hair still perfect despite what must have been a rushed journey. "Father, Lawrence briefed us on this situation," she said, her tone softening slightly but her eyes remaining fixed on Rose. "We were concerned when we learned about an unexpected visitor bearing gifts." Rose felt heat rising in her cheeks. "I should go," she said quietly, standing up. "Mr. Wheeler needs rest, not conflict." "Please stay," Thomas said firmly, his hand reaching out to grasp hers with surprising strength. "My family and I are due for an honest conversation, and I'd like you here as witness." The man who'd entered with Caroline stepped forward. "Dad, that's hardly necessary. We're just worried about you." "Are you, Richard?" Thomas's eyebrow arched. "This is the first time I've seen you since your mother's funeral 3 months ago, despite living 40 minutes away." Richard had the grace to look ashamed. The company that I built," Thomas interrupted, "and that would run perfectly well without you for an afternoon while you checked on your recently widowed father." The lawyer, Lawrence, cleared his throat. "Perhaps I should step outside." "No," said Thomas. "Stay. You're on my children's payroll now, apparently, so you might as well hear this too." Rose tried again to withdraw her hand, uncomfortable at being caught in this family drama, but Thomas held firm. "Mrs. Patterson," Caroline addressed her directly, her voice precise and measured, "I apologize if our concerns have offended you. But surely you understand. A wealthy, recently widowed man in my father's position can become a target for opportunistic individuals." "Caroline," Thomas began, but Rose squeezed his hand. "It's all right," she said, meeting Caroline's gaze steadily. "I understand your concern for your father. But I assure you, I wasn't aware of Mr. Wheeler's financial situation when I brought him some homemade food and a few small gifts. I'm a retired nurse with a comfortable pension and no desire for anyone's fortune." "A retired nurse," Richard repeated, exchanging glances with his sister. "With medical knowledge and access to medications." The accusation hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. Thomas's heart monitor began beeping more rapidly. "That's enough," he said, his voice rising. "You come here after months of neglect and accuse a kind stranger of trying to poison me? For God's sake, she found me at a community center lunch event where I was eating alone on Christmas Eve because neither of my children could be bothered to include their father in holiday plans." A nurse appeared at the doorway, alerted by the elevated heart rate. "Is everything all right in here?" "No," Thomas said bluntly. "My children are upsetting me. Please ask them to leave." "Dad," Caroline protested. The nurse looked uncertainly between them. "Perhaps we could keep the conversation calmer?" Dr. Chen was concerned about Mr. Wheeler's stress levels. Richard placed a restraining hand on his sister's arm. "We'll try to keep things civil," he promised the nurse, who nodded skeptically before leaving. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Lawrence shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly wishing to be anywhere else. Finally, Rose spoke. "Your father collapsed because of the confrontation at his door," she said quietly. "I brought him cookies and a hand-knitted scarf, not arsenic. I was there because I know what it's like to face the first Christmas without your spouse." Caroline's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "The lawyer said you were alone with him." "For perhaps 2 minutes," Rose confirmed. Hardly time to implement some elaborate scheme. Thomas had been watching his children carefully. Now he sighed deeply. "Do you know what your mother's last words to me were?" he asked, his voice suddenly tired. Both children looked startled by the change of subject. "She said, 'Tommy, don't waste whatever time you have left being bitter.'" His eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I've failed her in that. I've been so angry with both of you, for taking the company in directions I didn't approve of, for the ridiculous lawsuit last year, for barely visiting your mother during her illness." Richard flinched visibly. Caroline looked away. But Elaine was right, Thomas continued. Life is too short for grudges. Rose here reminded me of that with a simple act of kindness that neither of my children could manage. The monitor's beeping grew more erratic again. Rose instinctively checked the readout, her nurse's training never far from the surface. You need to calm down, she told him firmly. Your blood pressure is rising. Thomas nodded, taking several deep breaths. When he spoke again, his voice was weaker but determined. I want both of you to listen carefully. I am not senile. I am grieving, yes, but my mind is intact. If you continue to treat me like an incompetent child, I promise you I will rewrite my will and leave every penny to. He paused, his eyes meeting Rose's with a sudden glint, to people who showed genuine kindness without expectation of reward. Caroline paled. Richard stepped forward, his hands raised placatingly. Dad, we never meant. But Thomas never heard what they never meant. The monitor suddenly emitted a shrill alarm as his eyes rolled back and his body went rigid. He's seizing. Rose cried, immediately reaching for the emergency call button. Get the doctor, now. The next morning dawned cold and clear, Christmas Day arriving with indifferent beauty while the Wheelers and Rose waited in the hospital's private family room. Dr. Chen had emerged from Thomas's room an hour earlier with cautiously optimistic news. The seizure had been caused by a combination of stress, medication interaction, and exhaustion, but Thomas was stabilized and resting. Caroline sat with perfect posture in an armchair, her coat draped precisely over her arm, occasionally checking her phone. Richard paced by the window, watching snow blanket the hospital parking lot. Rose remained near the door, feeling like an intruder but unable to leave until she knew Thomas would recover fully. Mrs. Patterson, Richard said suddenly, breaking the tense silence. I owe you an apology. Rose looked up, surprised. Caroline's head turned sharply toward her brother. The nurse told us, he continued, rubbing the back of his neck. About how you recognized the seizure was coming before the machines did. How you knew exactly what to tell the medical team. She said your quick actions probably prevented more serious complications. Once a nurse, always a nurse, Rose replied simply. 38 years of instincts don't disappear with retirement. Caroline studied her with new interest. Where did you work? Memorial, mostly. The last 15 years in the oncology department. A strange expression crossed Caroline's face. Oncology? Here? When exactly? Rose thought back. I retired in 2018, so from about 2003 until then. The siblings exchanged a look that Rose couldn't interpret. Before she could question it, Dr. Chen appeared at the doorway. Mr. Wheeler is awake and asking for all of you, she said. He's quite insistent, though I've advised him to limit his excitement. Thomas looked smaller against the hospital pillows, an oxygen cannula beneath his nose, but his eyes were clear and alert. A nurse was adjusting his fore when they entered, the room now crowded with tension and unspoken words. Merry Christmas, Thomas said wryly. Not exactly how any of us planned to spend the holiday, I imagine. Caroline stepped forward first, hesitantly taking her father's hand. Dad, we were so worried. About me, or about your inheritance? The question held no malice, just weary sadness. Richard moved to the other side of the bed. We deserved that. But it really was about you. When Lawrence called. Thomas nodded slightly. I believe you. Now, at least. His gaze shifted to Rose, standing uncertainly at the foot of the bed. Rose, please come closer. There's something I need to ask you. She approached cautiously, aware of the Wheelers watching her every move. Your husband, Thomas said. Harold Patterson. He had Parkinson's, you said? Rose nodded, confused by the question. Yes, for 12 years before he passed. And you were his primary caregiver? Yes, especially in the later stages. Thomas's eyes searched hers intently. Did Harold ever participate in an experimental treatment program here at Memorial? Around 2010 or so? The question struck Rose like a physical blow. How could you possibly know that? A tear slipped down Thomas's weathered cheek. Because I funded it. The Wheeler Foundation's Neurodegenerative Disease Initiative. We donated $10 million to Memorial after my brother died of complications from Parkinson's. The room fell completely silent. Caroline's hand flew to her mouth. The trial gave Harold 3 more good years, Rose whispered, memories flooding back. Before the disease progressed again. The doctors said he responded better than almost anyone else in the program. I remember now, Thomas said softly. Your photo was in the foundation newsletter. The irony of the situation hung in the air, humbling them all. Outside the window, snow continued to fall, covering the world in clean white possibility. Dr. Chen returned, frowning at the emotional scene before her. Mr. Wheeler needs rest, she said firmly. You can continue this conversation when he's discharged, which won't be today if his vital signs don't improve. As they filed out of the room, Thomas called after them. Rose? Would you come back later? There's something important I'd like to discuss with you. Of course, she promised, puzzled by the meaningful look that passed between Thomas and his children. In the hallway, Caroline touched Rose's arm lightly. We're staying at the hotel across the street. Perhaps she would join us for Christmas dinner? We had the hotel arrange something in a private dining room. Rose hesitated, thinking of her quiet apartment, the small frozen dinner waiting in her freezer, the calls she would exchange with her children and grandchildren who lived too far away to visit. I'd like that, she said finally. Thank you. Richard nodded, a ghost of his father's smile crossing his face. It seems we have a lot to talk about. And to thank you for. As they walked toward the elevator together, Rose couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary had begun, something that went far beyond a basket of Christmas cookies and a knock on a stranger's door. 1 year later, the Wheeler mansion looked nothing like the hollow, soulless place Rose had first encountered. Evergreen garlands wrapped with twinkling lights draped across the grand staircase. The scent of cinnamon and pine filled the air. In the corner of the spacious living room stood a Christmas tree, not perfectly decorated by hired professionals, but beautifully chaotic with ornaments collected over decades, each with its own story and meaning. Thomas sat in his favorite armchair, watching his grandchildren, Caroline's teenagers and Richard's young twins, sprawled across the floor, playing a board game. His health had improved remarkably over the past year. The doctors attributed it to reduced stress and a renewed sense of purpose. Thomas knew it was something more, the healing power of reconciliation. More eggnog? Rose appeared at his side, her silver hair styled in a neat bob, wearing a festive red dress with a simple pearl necklace. Thank you, he said, accepting the glass. Are the dinner rolls almost ready? Caroline is threatening to start without them. Rose laughed. 5 more minutes. Your daughter is as impatient as you are. From the kitchen came the sounds of Caroline and Richard arguing good-naturedly about the proper way to carve a turkey. Their spouses intervened occasionally, their voices blending into the warm cacophony of family. The year had brought changes no one could have predicted that fateful Christmas Eve in the It's the second chapter fund, he continued, his voice strong and clear. It will provide grants to seniors beginning new ventures after loss, whether that's starting small businesses, pursuing education, or launching community projects. Because life doesn't end when we suffer a loss. Sometimes, that's precisely when the most important work begins. Richard raised his glass. To second chapters. And to kindness that comes full circle, Caroline added, her eyes meeting Rose's across the table. As they bowed their heads for grace, Thomas felt Elaine's presence more strongly than he had since her passing. She would have loved this, the house filled with laughter again, the healing of old wounds, the unexpected friendship with Rose. Outside, snow began to fall, just as it had that night at the hospital when everything changed. Thomas squeezed Rose's hand in gratitude before beginning the prayer. His lawyers might have arrived an hour after Rose that Christmas Eve, but her simple act of kindness had set in motion a transformation that no legal document could have accomplished. Later, as they enjoyed dessert by the fire, Thomas caught Rose looking at a photograph of Elaine on the mantel. "She would have liked you very much," he said quietly. Rose nodded. "And Harold would have appreciated your terrible jokes." They laughed together, two people who had discovered that grief shared becomes more bearable, that family can expand in unexpected ways, and that sometimes the most profound gifts come wrapped not in shiny paper, but in moments of compassion that arrive exactly when needed most. As the evening drew to a close, with promises to gather again for New Year's, Thomas stood at the door beside Rose, waving goodbye to the last departing car. The lawyer's knock 1 year ago had seemed like the end of something. Instead, it had been the beginning. "Merry Christmas, Rose," Thomas said softly. "Merry Christmas, my friend," she replied, her eyes reflecting the colored lights that adorned the doorway. "Here's to kindness that knocks on doors, and to the courage to answer when it does."